Let's go.
Welcome, everyone, to Advantaged and Alloy Partners podcast. My name is Drew Beechler. I'm our VP of Marketing here at Alloy Partners and your host of Advantaged. Alloy Partners, we're a venture builder. We partner with organizations and entrepreneurs to co-create advantage startups. And on the podcast, we interview corporate innovators, founders, investors, all around venture building, venture studios, and startup corporate partnerships, and telling the stories of how startups and big organizations win together. And today, with me here, we have a handful of very special guests from MIT Proto Ventures. We're joined by Gene Keselman, who's the managing director of MIT Proto Ventures, and two of their venture builders inside the venture studio, David Cohen-Tanugi and Andrew Inglis. Thank you all for joining me here today. So excited to have the four of us chatting.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's good to meet you, Drew.
What would be helpful to start with? I didn't tell you that we were going to do this, but even just a 30-second quick introduction. I feel like it's always helpful from like a context setting almost of each of your backgrounds and specialties. And maybe Gene, we'll start with you and then go to Andrew and David, but just share more around how you got to MIT Proto Ventures. I think understanding your background is really helpful as we get into a little more around the venture studio and the work that you all are doing.
I'll give you the 30-second summation. So I've been at MIT a little less than a decade. Well, went to a business school here and then was working on a startup and got recruited to run the new innovation initiative that was launched at MIT, and subsequently launched Proto Ventures a few years later with a bunch of faculty. And we have a good story to tell there, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. Prior to MIT, my background was dabbled in startups and nonprofits, but spent most of my career in the military and the Air Force.
And Andrew, how about yourself? What is your background?
Yeah, my background is physics. I did a physics PhD at Boston University. And after that, couple years of postdoc, and then became an entrepreneur and started a business, silver side detectors. We make nuclear bomb detectors, specifically neutron detectors, and did that for 10 years and just recently ended day to day. It's now its own entity, moving and making detectors, and really wanted to stay in the Boston community and start another startup and support the entire ecosystem. So that's how I joined Proto Ventures, been here for 6 months.
And David, how about yourself?
I am passionate about clean tech commercialization. That's really my thing. I am a material scientist and physicist by background, came actually right here to MIT about 15 years ago to get my PhD in material science and engineering, worked on water technology, and fell in love with this question of, given these new capabilities that we're developing, what do we do with them and how do we make sure that they have real impact in the world? I co-founded a startup called Ember Labs, doing personal thermal management, and spent about 8 years growing that company to about 250,000 customers. Spent some time after that leading the smart devices automation team at a smart grid company called OhmConnect before rejoining MIT in this venture builder role.
I love that we have lots of entrepreneurs here on the call, and especially repeat entrepreneurs, or maybe delusional enough entrepreneurs that want to do it again. Like I always find those folks, I don't know, whatever word you want to use to describe it, but enjoy it enough that you've done it before and seen behind the curtain. You're like, yeah, I want to sign up for another one of those. And so that's incredible. I think part of the story I'm sure that we'll tell with Proto Ventures will be really interesting to capture the why behind that. But that's exciting. Super glad to have all three of you on here today, and I think it'll be fun. If folks are unfamiliar, let's just take a step back of MIT Proto Ventures is the in-house venture studio inside MIT. And maybe Gene, I'll direct this to you. Tell me more about Proto Ventures and how maybe even Proto Ventures started originally there at MIT.
So we got started, like I said, about 5 or 6 years ago. We looked at the venture studio model and commercial venture studio model. Particularly, there was one venture studio down the road from MIT right here on campus, Flagship Pioneering, that was very successful in the biotech space and was very successfully taking some of the best talent from MIT. And so we looked at why they were doing that and what the incentive structure for those PhDs and postdocs to go work there. And we realized that it was this great opportunity to do deep tech, entrepreneurship, science, research, but also get paid like an entrepreneur or associate at a VC firm or something like that. Generally speaking, MIT can't compete on the commercial level, but we also realized there's no better sandbox than a research university for these kind of activities, or potentially there's no better sandbox than the university. We thought this model might work really well inside the university. Now, we talked to a lot of venture studios in the research of it. There was nothing existed like that, where you were completely within the university, took a commercial model and put it inside universities. My office there, as I mentioned earlier, was the Innovation Initiative. We were building startups within MIT, startup kind of programs and stuff. So this was in my job description to kind of try these sort of things. So we thought we'd run an experiment, and we looked for some funding. We got some funding from a large foundation that was looking to do healthcare and AI. They wanted to do, part of that was to do some entrepreneurship venture stuff around healthcare and AI. So they gave us some funding to do this experiment. And we hired our first venture builder and said, we'll give this a shot for 2 years, and worst happens that it doesn't work. That ended up working really well. That venture builder went on to launch 2 startups. He was very successful, and then one of those 2 is still around. And so we decided to keep going, and we did clean energy and fusion next, and then we hired David, and then we did geothermal, and we hired Andrew, and we hope to continue. The future looks good for new channels, what we call channels, is new studio topics, but also for collaborations with other universities. We've gotten, especially with the publication of the playbook, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But even before that, once word got around the university systems of this model, we've gotten a lot of interest from other universities. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for partnerships where you don't only have to think about MIT's research ecosystem, but many universities' research ecosystems, and how do you translate that at scale? So very exciting model. I think we've proven works pretty well.
Tell me more about the channel approach, as you called it, and how are these determined? How does a new channel come about, and how do you determine where you're going to point all of your efforts and energy?
That's a really good, insightful question, because that's like the real inflection point. Is the channels are all completely externally funded, and I think that is one of our superpowers, is that we don't ask MIT for any funding for this. We ask for outside partners to come in. To date, it's been mostly foundations, family offices, or philanthropic money. But the point is that that money comes with a mission, and that mission unifies our efforts around these topics or these channels. And rather than we have a million blooming flowers at MIT, it would be very hard for us to find one thing to focus on. That's the president usually has his or her really big initiatives, but there's so many things we could work on. And when we have outside funding come in and say, we really want you to go explore clean energy and fusion, that is unifying the mission of that studio. And then we go find the other faculty and the researchers and everything that's going on around that activity at MIT, so that funding and that venture builder become the center of gravity for that topic. And I think that's a really powerful part of the equation. There's a few super important variables to this model working, and I think that is the first important variable.
Yeah, and it gives it it feels like autonomy and freedom and kind of the ability to move faster. And to your point, yeah, you're no strings attached in some regards, at least, which then opens up the creative opportunities, if you will, to really dream big and go for the fences.
Really important point. Yes, we're not beholden to the university changing its mind. So as you may or may not have heard, universities are going through a little bit of a existential identity crisis these days. As long as we continue doing our mission and building valuable startups and attracting funders from the outside, we're not necessarily part of that internal churn, which is super important. And I think this model, as we wrote about in a recent op-ed into The Hill, this model is an example of how also to better utilize universities, because we're trying to take something that is a very underutilized process, which is translation of research, right? This money comes into universities in the billions. It funds really important papers and research, but a very tiny portion of that gets actually ever translated. And we are that next piece of, okay, let's take a look at all of the stuff that's already been funded, all of the stuff that's been created. This has a lot of work and intellectual property behind it. What's a new market? And this huge field of opportunity, all this noise, what is the signal that there's a new market here? And that process does not exist as an institutionalized process anywhere in universities. And so that's what we created, was that first institutionalized process.
We'll come back to this too, maybe towards the end, because I do want to dig into that kind of quite a bit more around the future for university and research funding. But you talked a couple of times about the R&D Venture Studio Playbook. You all recently published this, and it outlines how R&D organizations, and I really liked how you framed it as not just groups within research universities like an MIT, but also national laboratories, the R&D, kind of heavy R&D functions within private corporations as well. But how do they fix this R&D translation pipeline and turn innovation into this pillar within the organization? So tell me maybe more about the playbook as a whole, why the decision to publish it and release this externally.
Drew, we initially set out to build MIT Proto Ventures to solve a problem internal to MIT. and that is too many breakthroughs happening in labs not turning into the commercial impact and societal impact that they really ought to. And over the course of the last 5 years of actually building up this program and starting to see its results, what we learned is that we had developed a method and a model that's applicable not just to MIT, but to essentially any organization that's heavy on R&D. So obviously universities, but also national labs and large corporations that have big R&D labs and budgets and so on and so forth, and that want to get more impact out of their work. And we had enough success over the last 5 years to say, hey, we have something that works here. And of course, in the spirit of universities, we want to share that knowledge. So that's what motivated us really to create a blueprint of sorts, an open source framework that other R&D organizations can take and adopt to build essentially a venture studio in-house and build upon the Proto Ventures model to get more impact out of their discoveries.
I wrote this down, one of the stats, which I think you were alluding to. A mere 4.2% of patents filed or issued by academic institutions are ever really commercialized. And you all talk about that kind of, I think, towards the beginning of the playbook. But yeah, this is why we wrote this, is we have too much stuff sitting on the shelf, if you will. Why do so many promising technologies never make it out of the lab or out of the tech transfer office? And I think this is probably the core, obviously, of a lot of what the playbook tries to solve for. But yeah, maybe as you were thinking about pulling that together, why do we feel like that is?
I could take it to tap David out because he really thought hard about this and tried to represent it very well in the playbook. But it's certainly not because they've lacked potential to really make impact. And that's one of the whole points of the academic institution, to have impact on the world. And it does it in a particular way that we've been very happy to have done through the history of the world, the United States. But to get those inventions and those ideas into very high impact translational companies and products, we've always had it just be a serendipitous process, essentially. It's been a combination of hard work from certain people, luck, and just perfect circumstances for it to jump out and be one of these great things that we see coming out of the university. And that's fine. I mean, we've just almost assumed that everything else, what is it, 95.6% of the rest is collateral damage to a very natural process. And we basically, I think right now we're thinking that this is not going to cut it. We really want to show the world that universities have so much more to offer to have impactful influence in our entire market, commercial markets, capitalist markets. So changing that 4.2, that's the inception of the question. How can you change the 4.2 to 10.2 or 20.2? And that was the inception of the question, how to do it. Then you start asking why. Incentive misalignment, researchers get promoted based on publications, academic impact, not by finding commercial licensors or inventions that they can spin out. There's always caveats to this, but that's the 4.2, right? Those are the people that we hear about and we think, oh, it's happening everywhere. It's not happening everywhere. It's a very shallow bench. And then lack of industry awareness. Just thinking deeply on this, every single lab I've ever been in has a motivation for why they do what they do. And there might be even some commercial story to it, but it is a very weak link that has been accepted to just be weak. And we wanted it that way because you really want the universities to be able to explore a lot, but not really being aware of very specific needs in critical industries that really need a lot more things to be pulled out. That we saw as a big gap. So the solution is everything that we're doing here at the Venture Studio.
Andrew, I think you touched on an important part there. It's the separation of church and state almost, you need the industry and the market and the commercialization process and to be included in that to also make it successful. At the same time, you need some of that separation, or incentives are probably misaligned in some ways. In particular with Proto Ventures, the venture builder program and what you and David are doing as venture builders within Proto Ventures, I think is a unique model of you're sitting there in the lab, you also have some of that market experience and kind of backgrounds. What has been the Proto Ventures approach to that of how do we find that balance, what's worked, what hasn't over the last 5 years or so as well?
So from day one, we were, like I mentioned, this was all an experiment. We thought that getting these, what we call kind of entrepreneur super postdocs in to do this work would be important. We didn't understand how important it would be that we really hire as the first priority. And this is an example where hiring is destiny. And when I talk to corporations, governments, other universities about this model, this is what I lead with is whatever you do, figure out how to structure your system such that you incentivize the best possible person to come in and be your venture builder. And it starts and ends with that. And everything else will fall in line after that, because it doesn't matter how good I am, how good our system is, how good our researchers. If you don't have the right people inside the ecosystem, embedded in the labs, doing the day-to-day work, creating the allegiances and the relationships and all the things that they have to do to actually translate the research that would not otherwise be translated, you realize how important having the Andrews and the Davids of the world come in and do this is. And the last thing I'll say on that is sometimes the problem with the commercial model, or the advantage we have over the commercial venture studio model, is that we don't have to worry about the financial incentives on the front end. And I know it's not easy for someone in VC or venture studios to understand that we don't take any carry. The university doesn't take a cut. What David and Andrew walk out the door with is entirely theirs to build teams around, to split equity, to create cap tables. And that incentivizes what we call these unicorn humans, these people that could otherwise do other things. They could be starting their own startups already. They don't need to be inside MIT, but they want to come because what better playground is there than a university research environment? And what they build is theirs. And if I was coming and saying, look, you're great, you can do whatever you want, you have infinite optionality, come here, build startups out of MIT with me, and I'll take half of your startup before you even walk out the door, I don't think I can attract the kind of talent that we've attracted. I'm not saying that is the right model for other folks that need to figure out some kind of carry model to continue to be sustainable, obviously financially sustainable. But I do think that whatever you do, figure out, how do I get the A+ humans in here to build, because nothing else really matters.
I love that.
I'm also happy to talk a little bit about what being a venture builder has meant for me. Essentially, the Proto Ventures model is premised on the idea that something magical and quite impactful happens when you take people who have the relevant background and you make it their full-time job to think about commercialization and commercial potential in a research-heavy environment. And you embed them in that research environment for a period of years, not to do research, not to publish, not to get tenure, not to administer programs or to educate other people or to fund grants or all these other things they could be doing, but instead just to look for where are the neglected, under-leveraged, or possibly completely inexistent commercialization opportunities that could change the world and make for a really successful business. And it takes a certain kind of individual to do that, right? You need to have entrepreneurial experience to know what questions to ask and to know what the path is going to look like. You need domain expertise in whatever industry you're proposing to make an impact in. And of course, you need enough technical chops to first have credibility really with the researchers so that you can fit in and be trusted by them and have them feel like it's worth their time to explain to you what they're doing, and enough technical chops to actually understand what it is that they're doing and meaningfully incorporate that into your thinking and your brainstorming. And that's really what the model is premised on in my experience. And what that means in practice for somebody like myself or like Andrew is very early on, as we embed in labs at MIT with this mission of identifying and building the biggest commercialization opportunities, we split our time across 3 big dimensions. The first third is tech scouting. Essentially, it's talking to as many researchers as possible, taking out grad students out for lunch, attending thesis defenses, reading academic papers, browsing recent patents and so on, and talking to professors and everything to understand what's out there, what's been invented or being developed recently that could really change the world and is not necessarily going anywhere or slated to go anywhere. The second third is really the converse of that, and that is understanding what problems out there are not solved. What are the holy grail needs that the market has, and that involves speaking, of course, to large corporates who would be the potential partners, customers, acquirers of any of these ventures, but also analysts, consultants, the venture capital community, policy folks, whoever can help you understand what fundamentally you should be looking for and really where the big needle-moving levers would be if you were to find them. And then the third piece is really ecosystem building. So a lot of networking with folks within MIT, both on the engineering side and on the, say, business side of the campus, alumni, local entrepreneurs, advisors, corporates, basically anybody who, in the proverbial it takes a village analogy, anybody who's going to contribute to this village, ultimately that is going to be one of these startups. And it's really with those 3 types of ingredients, people, technologies, and problems, that we spend our time trying to connect dots, right? Where do we find dots that nobody had really connected quite before or not successfully yet? And then we run essentially a pretty structured process by which all of the different possibilities and ideas that have come to mind through various kinds of brainstorming advance through a rigorous funnel until there's actual companies to launch commercially and go down the product building, team building, fundraising, customer building process.
I might just throw one as the third, the first third, second third of your voices. I think every channel also is unique of what's needed. And this is another one of the beauties of the channel model that Gene mentioned. It's one of the superpowers. The way I would describe the superpower is that it's a mission that you can obsess over as an entrepreneur. So you come in and you have a mission to support an industry or a movement of a new technology that could change the world. Geothermal is certainly one of those right now in the world. And that gives you these guardrails that are very valuable in this process because you can learn about an entire ecosystem of the industry, everyone in it, all the academics, companies, investors, problems that need to be addressed over the next 10 years. And I would say that's one of my big thirds of what I'm doing. And then the other third, that was David's second third. And the first third is to connect it with all the research that's happening at MIT and start linking capabilities that MIT has to be able to solve some of these and maybe spin out some technology that can solve it. And it's interesting to hear David speak about his channel and my channel. There's a lot of overlap, but I want to mention that this model that we have also gives the freedom for these different topics, these different channels to have different flavors of how you can really hit the mission. And that's needed. You need that nimbleness. And this gets back to Gene just saying, hire the right people. Just hire someone that is obsessed about solving the problem by starting something new. And sometimes those paths look a little bit different, but if you hire the right people, you can use the base, which is like the playbook. The playbook is great because it is a base that you can build off of from your channel. But the channel might have different focus points of saying, oh man, I got to do this before I do this. And who better to do that than an entrepreneur that just did it for the last decade and was either successful or not successful and learned a lot about that process. And so it does always come back to the people, this whole model. And I don't know, I just started thinking about an analogy of, I did Teach for America way back when, and it's this big program to get undergrads that just graduate into urban school districts to change education in the United States. They have a playbook. I got a big playbook in the beginning of being taught in summer in Houston where we did our training, but it all was to train hundreds and hundreds of people that were the core of the program. And so that's how I think about the playbook and these people diving into the different channels, solving the problems that are happening in every channel independently.
Are you both able to share maybe a little bit more of some of the key focuses of your individual channels and or some of your favorite ideas or problems or businesses you've worked on or successes that have come out of those over the last little while?
Sure. I'm happy to share an example. Vertical Horizons is a company that was launched in 2024 out of the Fusion and Clean Energy channel. They recently raised a nearly $8 million seed round to commercialize power supply units for AI data centers, specifically to make those power supply units more compact and more energy efficient, which is very timely, as I'm sure you know. And to give a bit of backdrop to that story and that success, if you will, and give it a bit more context, there was a core technology that came from the electrical engineering department at MIT. And that essentially involved a new way of growing a special class of semiconductor devices. But it wasn't really until one of our Proto Ventures fellows, whose name is Cynthia Liao, it wasn't until she really teamed up with the researchers and connected the dots between the technology that had been developed and the major trends in the AI and data center and hyperscaler industry that a real commercial effort came into being. And over the course of the time really coming into being and then ultimately incubating within Proto Ventures, what was basically just a technology, high-level aspiration, turned into a very fast-moving, hopefully very impactful and commercially successful startup.
I might just add, I've been here for 6 months, so I'm still incubating even my first success stories. But I'd say that it's really cool because when I came in, I started getting the lay of the land of opportunities that are related to geothermal at MIT. And some of them were these amazing ideas that were almost ready to just be supported to start moving to funding sometime in the upcoming months. And then there's ones that are all the way on the other side where they could be supportive of geothermal, but we don't know yet. And there needs to be a lot more work to be done. So it's almost like a scale-free amount of those. So there's one or two ready I need to support to get right off the edge, and then there's 5 or 6 down at the other end. And then with this building of ecosystem, that's still happening. So I'm still bringing the professors together to brainstorm and come up with new links to their capabilities and the needs of geothermal. So yeah, that's what I would say for startups that I'm working on right now.
Generally, what we've seen on average is that a venture builder ends up putting out or collaborating on the creation over the course of 2 years, putting out roughly 2 to 4 startups. That's roughly the rate that we've seen. So in the fusion and clean energy case, I mentioned Vertical Horizons. We also are launching a startup doing plasma sensing and diagnostics for fusion experiments and fusion devices, a company called Hyperion Transport Systems that's building a new class of satellite thruster for any type of satellite or space mission, and a company called Interlink that's building a much more efficient and collaborative platform for grid interconnection of projects. And the other thing I'll call out, because Drew, your question was about startups that came out, but also just more generally about projects that we've been excited about. There's the tail end of our process is startups, obviously. That's the whole point. But by virtue of being embedded within a research environment, we end up having a kind of longer term effect on the mindset and the projects that are happening inside the lab. And so it'll take a little bit longer for that to bear fruit and for people to know exactly what came out of that. But a lot of our time is spent nurturing researchers and giving them a sense of how to think about problems, or giving them visibility into what market needs exist out there that they might spend time on, or creating projects that might not turn into a startup in 12 months because maybe there's another year or two of R&D to finish before it's really worth commercializing, but that are eventually going to see the light of day. And so I have a number of those examples that I've been really excited about that are not technically startups, but very much count as impact of a venture studio inside an R&D organization.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think it maybe to circle back to what, Gene, you were saying a little bit earlier too, just with inside the research organization as a whole, the intangible benefits also are so valuable. And I think today we were talking earlier about the current state of government-university relations and how universities should be thinking about entrepreneurship. In particular, kind of you mentioned the op-ed that you wrote in The Hill. And I'll just share this quote that was one of my favorites and then ask for any and all of your thoughts around how is this evolving in the future, and how is MIT Proto Ventures, in my view, helping lead the way in many of this. But the quote that I love that I felt summed up a lot of the op-ed said, "To maintain the relevance and continue to support our national security, universities must codify translation and entrepreneurship as a crucial pathway for making a difference. Research labs must move beyond passive spillovers and become active launchpads for new companies that leverage federally funded research." And I thought the whole piece is just how do you rethink, like, what is the role of entrepreneurship really within a university? And I think these are lots of examples maybe of how some of that is playing out with Proto Ventures especially.
Yeah, so there's a moment in time issue here. Sometimes we also get to the point where when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And we wanted to avoid coming out and saying Proto Ventures fixes all the problems. But I do believe that generally speaking, we mentioned it a couple times here, and I think there is a general misunderstanding in the common man or woman's view of universities, of what universities are and what their great value is. And it's not just about teaching, right? The universities are the first foundational layer of our development, as societal development of technology and ideas. And the future will start at a university, at the research level inside the university, whatever the topic you're talking about. And so I think part of the point was not just to say, hey, look, universities aren't as bad. All you hear about is all these bad things about what universities are doing. We're doing some good here too, but like that, we know we can do better. And we've made such a huge impact on the world already. Think about what we could do if we made even more concerted effort to really think about impact, not just about publishing. The point is that's what we're trying to say, is that we can do better. It's not just please stop yelling at us and please just let us continue doing our jobs. Yeah, we can do better. And there are models out there. This happens to be one of them that really does try to focus universities on what we call the third pillar of translation, of impact.
Yeah, I love that.
There's been one key learning for me in this time at Proto Ventures that I think is really probably relevant to any venture builder, any venture building organization, and any person in one of these venture builder, EIR, founder in residence type roles. And that is the interplay of technology push and market pull. It's something that everybody knows that to build a successful business, you've got to both be addressing a real pressing market customer need and also have some differentiated way of solving that need so other people can imitate you. What I have seen, and that I think is something I get very excited about, is there's traditionally been a gap. Universities, they have plenty of technologies and plenty of solutions, and sometimes they don't do anything with those solutions, which is what we've been talking about for a long time. But even when they do, it feels it's very tech push oriented. Back to, and Gene was talking about hammers and nails. Most university translation, technology translation, or commercialization efforts take the form of we've got this one technology and that therefore we have this one company. Its job is to commercialize the technology. And surprise, that doesn't always turn into great companies. Maybe it doesn't solve that big of a market problem, or maybe actually you needed some brilliant business model idea to go with it in order to get anywhere, and so on and so forth. And so tech push, which is a favorite modality of universities and national labs and so on and so forth, it's not really enough. And then the converse is what happens if you have a venture building organization that's separate from it, doesn't have really good access to a research organization or a bunch of labs in-house, which is you can think about market problems all day long, but you don't really have any good differentiated solutions. And so you default to pure business model innovation, or maybe you throw a little bit of AI and ChatGPT at it or something, but you don't end up with highly differentiated businesses that way. And so this is, I think, a conundrum that I think the entire entrepreneurship and venture building community is grappled with. And I think there's something very special and interesting about trying to marry tech push and market pull on the same level, equally balanced, with something like what we are doing here in a university, but having entrepreneurs embedded in this way.
I think that's such a good point.
I would just add it, and then have a David to work out the hundreds of little roadblocks that exist that make that number 4.2% in that model that he just described, because that's what it requires. You can't just have the idea to have the pull and the push be at the same level. It's also to have David in the labs with maybe a handful of really great ideas and seeing a barrage of little tiny issues, like the professor doesn't understand how much work and effort it is to do a business model, or he doesn't understand that another set of experiments need to happen, or you don't have the right person to shepherd into a great role. What I really like about this whole model is that there is a couple of just the variables that Gene was talking about. PhD level entrepreneur in residence, plopped in the seat, obsessed about a mission and a topic, solving all those problems. That's what differentiates us from 20 different programs that help entrepreneurs at MIT. It's really valuing that could be the variable that cracks open and tries and solves a lot of little tiny problems and really moves the needle.
I think that's so eloquently put, both of you, in terms of just how do you think about that blend of the balance and what makes it truly unique. I love the approach that you all have taken and just the moonshot ideas of how do we really make an impact and a difference on the world through this tech push and kind of market pull equilibrium, if you will, which is such a great way to think about it. Well, thank you all for joining me this afternoon. This is an incredible conversation and hopefully one that we can continue to have for a long time and continue to root for and see all of the companies you all are working on continue to grow and thrive. So this is incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Drew.
Thanks for having us, Drew.